You know that feeling when you're lying in bed at 3 a.m., and suddenly you remember something from your childhood that doesn't quite add up. Something that seemed normal at the time, but now, with adult eyes, makes your skin crawl. That's what happened to me when I started really thinking about fire drills. We all remember them, don't we? The sudden ear-piercing alarm, the teacher's practiced smile as she herded us into neat little lines. The way we'd file out of the building, single file, quiet as mice, just a routine safety procedure, they told us, just in case of emergency. But what if I told you that some fire drills weren't about fire at all? What if they were about something far more sinister? What if those seemingly innocent evacuations were actually ... selections? I've spent the last few months collecting stories from people who, like me, have begun to question what really happened during those childhood fire drills. The stories you're about to hear aren't just unsettling, they're proof that something was seriously wrong with the system we all trusted so completely. Before we dive into these testimonies, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like button, it helps more than you know. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Dr. Bonshield to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support keeps these stories coming. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever experienced something strange during a fire drill? Or maybe you've noticed something off about your own school experiences. Share your thoughts below now. Let me tell you about the first story. It comes from Marcus, a 34-year-old accountant from Cedar Heights, a quiet suburb outside Portland. What started as a routine fire drill in his elementary school became something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Story 1. The Substitute's Clipboard. My name is Marcus, and I need to tell you about something that happened to me in 3rd grade. Something I've never been able to explain, no matter how hard I've tried to rationalize it away. It was October 1999, and I was 8 years old, attending Maple Grove Elementary in Cedar Heights. You know, the kind of pastry-lined streets, white picket fences, the sort of neighborhood where nothing bad was supposed to happen. My teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was out sick that day, and we had a substitute. I remember her name was Ms. Crane, though I'm not sure if that was her real name anymore. Ms. Crane was ... different, not in any way I could put my finger on at the time, but looking back, there were signs. She was tall, probably in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her skin. Her eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and she had this habit of staring at us for just a beat too long when she called on someone. She carried a clipboard everywhere, constantly scribbling notes in handwriting so small and cramped it looked like insect tracks. The fire drill happened. Around 10:30 a.m., we were in the middle of a math lesson when the alarm started, its familiar shriek, but something was off immediately. The sound seemed wrong, not just loud, but somehow discordant, like two different tones fighting each other. Several kids covered their ears, and I saw Jenny Morrison start to cry. "All right, children," Miss Crane said, her voice cutting through the alarm with unnatural clarity. "You know the drill. Single file, no talking." But as we lined up, I noticed she was checking names off her clipboard. This wasn't normal. During regular fire drills, teachers just counted heads. They didn't take attendance. I watched her pale eyes scan each of us, and every time she made a check mark, her thin lips would curve into what might have been a smile. Filed out of the building, but instead of going to our usual spot on the playground, Ms. Crane led us to the far end of the school property, near the old maintenance shed that had been abandoned for years. The grass there was yellowed and patchy, and there was something about the place that made my skin crawl. Even at 8 years old, I knew we weren't supposed to be there. "Wait here," Miss Crane instructed, positioning us in a tight cluster. "Don't move, don't speak." The other classes were nowhere to be seen. Through the chain-link fence, I could see them assembled in their normal spots, but we were isolated, hidden behind the shed like we were being kept separate on purpose. The alarm had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was too complete, too heavy. Ms. Crane walked along our line, clipboard in hand, studying each of us with those colorless eyes. When she reached me, she paused, tilting her head like a bird examining a worm. Up close, I could see that her skin had an odd waxy quality, and there was something wrong with her smell, not perfume or soap, but something chemical and sharp that made my nose burn. "Marcus," she said, though I hadn't told her my name. We hadn't done introductions. "You're observant, aren't you?" I nodded, too scared to speak. "Good," she whispered, making another mark on her clipboard. "Very good." She moved on to the next child, but I could feel her attention lingering on me like a weight. My hands were shaking, and I didn't understand why. This was just a fire drill, just a routine exercise. but every instinct in my 80-year-old body was screaming that something was terribly wrong. That's when I noticed a van. It was parked just outside the fence, barely visible through the gap between the shed and the school building. Dark blue with tinted windows and no license plate that I could see. The driver's door was open and someone was sitting inside, but I couldn't make out any details. Just a shadow, watching us. Ms. Crane finished her inspection and walked to the fence. She spoke to the person in the van, but I couldn't hear what she said. The conversation was brief, maybe 30 seconds, and then she returned to us. "Change of plans," she announced. "We're going to practice a different kind of drill today, a special drill." She began calling names from her clipboard. Not all of us, just some, maybe half the class. When she called a name, that child would step forward, and she'd guide them toward the gate and the fence. The gate I hadn't noticed before, the one that led directly to where the van was parked. "Sarah Chen," she called. Sarah, a quiet girl who always sat in the front row, walked forward with the mechanical obedience of a sleepwalker. Timothy Brooks, Tim, who lived 3 houses down from me, joined Sarah at the gate. Marcus Fitzgerald. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move. I couldn't move. Every muscle in my body had locked up, and I was suddenly aware of how isolated we were, how far from help. "Marcus," Miss Crane repeated, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "Come here." I took a step forward, then another. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, drowning out everything else. The selected children stood in a neat line by the gate, their faces blank and docile. There was something wrong with their eyes. They looked unfocused, almost dreamy. Just as I reached the gate, I heard shouting from the main building. Real shouting, not the controlled chaos of a fire drill. Ms. Crane's head snapped up, and for just a moment her mask slipped. The expression that crossed her face was one of pure animal fury. "Get back in line," she hissed at us now. We scrambled back to our positions as Principal Morrison came running around the corner of the building, his face red with exertion and confusion. "What are you doing over here?" he demanded. "The drill ended 5 minutes ago. Everyone's back inside." Miss Crane's demeanor shifted instantly. She became apologetic, flustered, explaining that she'd gotten confused about the procedures. But I saw her quietly tear a page from her clipboard and slip it into her pocket. The van's engine started, and by the time Mr. Morrison looked toward the fence, it was gone. We were escorted back to the building, and Miss Crane disappeared during lunch. The office said she'd had a family emergency. Mrs. Henderson was back the next day, and when I tried to tell her what happened, she just patted my head and said I had an active imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what almost happened. 3 weeks later, I was walking home from school when I saw the van again. It was parked across the street from the playground, and the same shadowy figure was behind the wheel. I ran home and told my parents, but by the time we got back, it was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the other children, the ones who'd been selected. Sarah, Tim, and the others. They seemed different after that day, quieter, more withdrawn. And sometimes, when I'd catch their eye in the hallway, they'd look right through me, like they were seeing something else entirely. I started paying attention to substitute teachers after that. Really paying attention, and over the years, I began to notice patterns. The way certain subs would carry clipboards with pre-written lists. The way they'd study us with that same calculating intensity. The way fire drills would sometimes happen at odd times, with unusual procedures. I'm 34 now, and I still live in Cedar Heights. Last month, I was driving past my old elementary school when I saw something that made my hands shake so badly I had to pull over. There was a substitute teacher walking across the parking lot, tall and thin, with steel gray hair and a clipboard clutched to her chest. Daughter was Ms. Crane. I'm sure of it. She looked exactly the same as she had 25 years ago. I sat in my car for an hour, watching. Eventually, the fire alarm started, and I saw her leading a group of children toward the back of the building, toward the old maintenance shed. Called the police, but by the time they arrived, everyone was back inside. The substitute had left due to a family emergency, and there was no record of any Ms. Crane in the district's system. I've been researching since then, trying to find others who remember similar experiences, and I've found them. Dozens of them. All across the country, all with the same story. The substitute teacher, the clipboard, the van, the selection process that was interrupted just in time. But here's what keeps me awake at night. What about the times when no one interrupted? What about the children who were selected and walked through that gate? I think about Sarah Chen sometimes. I looked her up on social media, and she seems normal enough. Married, 2 kids, living in Seattle. But in every photo there's something in her eyes, something distant and hollow, like she's looking at a world the rest of us can't see. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I'm only remembering the fire drill that was interrupted. I wonder if there were others, ones where the selection process was completed. I wonder if some part of me walked through that gate after all. Story 2, The Sound Chamber. My name is Alina, and I'm going to tell you about the day I realized that some fire drills weren't meant to save lives. They were meant to steal something far more precious than that. I was 11 years old in the spring of 2003, attending Riverside Middle School in Millbrook, a sleepy town in upstate New York. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest scandal was usually someone's divorce or a fender bender at the four-way stop. The kind of place where you never locked your doors and kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. I was always what you'd call a sensitive child. I could hear things others couldn't, the hum of fluorescent lights, the whisper of air through ventilation systems, the subtle differences in people's voices that told you when they were lying. My parents thought I was just imaginative, maybe a little too observant for my own good. They had no idea how right they were. The fire drill that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in April. I remember because it was the day after we'd gotten our state test scores back, and I'd scored in the 99th percentile for the 3rd year running. Mrs. Patterson, our homeroom teacher, had made a big deal about it in front of the whole class, which made me want to crawl under my desk and disappear. At 2:15 p.m., the fire alarm went off. But from the moment I heard it, I knew something was different. The sound was wrong, not just the usual steady blare, but something layered underneath it. A lower frequency, almost below the threshold of hearing, that made my teeth ache and my vision blur slightly at the edges. I looked around at my classmates as we lined up. None of them seemed to notice anything unusual. They were chatting and joking like always, but their voices sounded muffled to me, like they were speaking through water. Even Mrs. Patterson seemed unaffected, herding us toward the door with her usual efficiency. But as we walked down the hallway, I realized we weren't heading for the main exit. We were going deeper into the school, toward the basement level where the old bomb shelter was located. The one that had been sealed off since the 1960s, or so they told us. Where are we going? I asked Tommy Martinez, who was walking beside me. He looked at me with glassy, unfocused eyes. Fire drill, he said in a monotone voice. Following procedure. That's when I noticed that about half the class was missing. The other half, the ones who remained, all had the same vacant expression as Tommy. They moved in perfect synchronization, like they were being controlled by some invisible puppeteer. I was the only one who seemed aware of what was happening. Mrs. Patterson led us down a stairwell I'd never seen before, one that must have been hidden behind a door that was usually locked. The walls were older here, built from concrete blocks instead of the modern drywall upstairs. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something chemical and sharp that made my eyes water. We descended to flights, then walked down a long corridor lined with pipes and electrical conduits. The sound that had been lurking beneath the fire alarm was getting stronger, more defined. It was like a tuning fork struck against glass, a pure tone that seemed to resonate in my bones. At the end of the corridor was a heavy metal door marked with radiation symbols and warnings in multiple languages. Mrs. Patterson produced a keycard from her pocket. When had she gotten that? And swiped it through a reader. The door clicked open with a sound like breaking bones. Beyond was a room I can only describe as a sound chamber. The walls were covered in acoustic tiles arranged in complex geometric patterns. At the center of the room was a raised platform with metal chairs arranged in a perfect circle, each one equipped with what looked like headphones connected to a central console. But the most disturbing part was the observation window on the far wall. Behind it, I could see figures in white lab coats, their faces obscured by the reflection of the glass. They were watching us, waiting. "Please take your seats," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice taking on the same hollow quality as the students. "The testing will begin shortly." Testing, that word sent ice through my veins. I hung back as the other students filed obediently to the chairs, their movements still perfectly synchronized. I counted them 12 students, all of them from the accelerated program, all of them high achievers, all of them like me. As they sat down and put on the headphones, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. Their eyes had gone completely white, rolled back in their heads until only the sclera showed. They sat perfectly still, hands folded in their laps, while the sound, that horrible, penetrating tone, grew louder and more complex. Mrs. Patterson turned to me, and I saw that her eyes had changed too. Not white like the students, but completely black, like looking into deep water at night. "Alina," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the acoustic chamber. "You're resisting. That's unexpected." I backed toward the door, but it had already sealed shut behind us. The sound was getting louder, more insistent. I could feel it trying to burrow into my mind, to take control of my thoughts the way it had controlled the others. "What are you doing to them?" I whispered. Mrs. Patterson smiled. But it wasn't her smile. It was something else, wearing her face, something that had never been human. "We're improving them," she said, "taking their gifts and making them useful. Children like you, with your enhanced perceptions, your ability to process information differently, you're the next step in human evolution. We're just guiding the process." The sound reached a crescendo, and suddenly I could hear voices within it, not speaking, but screaming, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The voices of children who had sat in these chairs before, who had been improved and changed and made into something else entirely. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound went deeper than that. It was in my bones, in my blood, trying to rewrite the very pattern of my thoughts. I could feel my consciousness starting to slip, my sense of self beginning to dissolve into something larger and more terrible. But then I remembered something my grandmother had told me about our family. It came from a long line of what she called listeners, people who could hear the world in ways others couldn't. And with that gift came a responsibility to bear witness, to remember, to resist. I focused on that memory, on the sound of my grandmother's voice, and used it as an anchor. The artificial tone washed over me, but it couldn't take hold. I was still myself, still Alina, still aware. The figures behind the observation window were gesturing frantically now. Equipment was being adjusted. The sound pattern was changing, becoming more aggressive, but I held on, clutching to my identity like a life preserver in a storm. That's when I heard atrial fire alarms. From somewhere above us, multiple alarms, and the sound of running feet, shouting. The real fire department, responding to a real emergency. Mrs. Patterson's borrowed face twisted with rage. "No," she hissed. "Not again, we were so close." The sound chamber went silent. The students slumped in their chairs, unconscious but breathing. The figures behind the window were moving quickly now, gathering equipment, preparing to evacuate, but Mrs. Patterson looked at me one last time, and I saw something in those black eyes that chilled me to the bone. Recognition. She knew who I was now, what I was capable of, and she would remember. "This isn't over," she said, and then she was gone, vanishing through a door I hadn't noticed before. The real fire department found us 20 minutes later. The official story was that there had been a gas leak in the basement, and some students had been overcome by fumes. The sound chamber was described as an old civil defense facility that had been used for emergency shelter training. The students who had been in the chairs remembered nothing, but I remembered everything. In the weeks that followed, I tried to tell people what had really happened. My parents, the police, even the FBI, but there was no evidence. The sound chamber had been cleaned out, the equipment removed. Mrs. Patterson had taken a leave of absence due to stress and was never seen again. The other students returned to normal, mostly, but they were different, quieter, more compliant, and sometimes, when I looked at them in the hallway, I could see something moving behind their eyes, something that wasn't quite human anymore. I spent the rest of my school years watching and waiting, expecting another fire drill that would take me back to that chamber. But it never came. I think they knew I was too dangerous to try again, too aware of what they were really doing. Years later, I became an investigative journalist. I've spent most of my career tracking down stories like mine, following the trail of unusual fire drills and missing children and schools with basements that officially don't exist. And I've found them scattered across the country like breadcrumbs, leading to something much larger and more terrifying than any of us imagined. The program, whatever it was, is still active. I've documented at least 30 similar incidents. In the past 15 years, always the same pattern: gifted children, unusual fire drills, and afterwards, kids who are just a little bit different, a little bit less human. I think they're building something, an army, maybe, or a network. Children who look normal but think differently, who process information in ways that serve some larger purpose. And the truly terrifying part is that most of them don't even know they've been changed. Last month, I received an email from someone calling themselves the listener. Just 2 words: "They're coming." The message was sent from an untraceable account, but somehow I knew it was legitimate. After all these years, they're finally ready to make their move. I've been having the dreams again. The sound chamber, the chairs, the figures behind the glass. But now there are more chambers, dozens of them, filled with children who sit perfectly still while that horrible tone rewrites their minds. And sometimes, in the dreams, I'm sitting in one of those chairs too, my eyes rolled back, my hands folded, in my lap, while something that was once Mrs. Patterson leans over me and whispers, "Welcome home, Alina. We've been waiting for you." I wake up screaming, but the sound follows me into the waking world. That pure, penetrating tone that tried to steal my soul all those years ago. It's getting stronger, more insistent. I think they're calling me back. Story 3. The Principal's Office. My name is David, and I used to be a teacher. Used to be, because after what I discovered at Clearwater Elementary, I can never set foot in a school again without my hands shaking and my vision blurring with panic. I was 26 when I started teaching 4th grade at Clearwater Elementary in Oakdale, a picture-perfect suburb outside Denver. It was 2018, and I was fresh out of my master's program, full of idealism and energy. I wanted to make a difference, to be the kind of teacher who inspired kids to love learning. Clearwater was everything I'd hoped for in a first assignment. Modern facilities, involved parents, and a principal, Dr. Margaret Holloway, who had a reputation for innovation and excellence. She'd been there for 15 years, and under her leadership, the school had become a model for the district. Dr. Holloway was an impressive woman, tall, authoritative, with prematurely silver hair and sharp green eyes that seemed to see everything. She had a way of making everyone feel both welcomed and slightly intimidated. The kids respected her, the parents trusted her, and the teachers, while we all wanted her approval. She took a special interest in me from the beginning. "Fresh perspectives," she'd say with that enigmatic smile of hers. "That's what we need to keep evolving." She'd often stop by my classroom, observing my teaching methods, asking detailed questions about my students' progress. I was flattered by the attention, especially when she started inviting me to special committee meetings, professional development opportunities, she called them. These were small groups of teachers who met after hours to discuss advanced pedagogical techniques and student optimization strategies. The meetings were held in the basement conference room, a space I'd never seen before despite having worked at the school for 3 months. Dr. Holloway explained that it was usually reserved for district-level meetings, but she wanted to use it for our special projects. The other teachers in the group were all veterans, people who'd been at Clearwater for years, who had Dr. Holloway's complete trust. They spoke in acronyms and shorthand that I didn't understand, discussing selection protocols and implementation, timelines and subject responsiveness metrics. When I asked what they were talking about, Dr. Holloway would smile and say, "All in good time, David. First, we need to see how well you integrate with the team." The first fire drill I witnessed, as part of the inner circle, happened in November. I was asked to assist with documentation and observation, which meant carrying a clipboard and watching how the drill unfolded. Dr. Holloway explained that the district was implementing new safety protocols and wanted detailed reports on their effectiveness. The drill itself seemed normal at first. The alarm sounded, teachers led their classes out in orderly lines, and everyone assembled in the designated areas on the playground. But then I noticed that Dr. Holloway was directing certain classes to different locations. "Variance testing," she explained when I asked. "We're evaluating how well students adapt to changes in routine." Mrs. Chun's 3rd grade class was led to the far side of the building, near the maintenance shed. Mr. Rodriguez's 5th graders were taken to the parking lot behind the gym. My own 4th grade class was directed to stay in the main assembly area, and I watched from there as the other groups were isolated in their separate locations. Each group had a teacher with them, but they also had what Dr. Holloway called safety coordinators, adults I didn't recognize, wearing official-looking badges and carrying tablets instead of clipboards. They moved through the isolated groups, scanning QR codes on the children's school ID badges and making notes on their devices. "What are they recording?" I asked Dr. Holloway. "Biometric data," she replied casually. "Heart rate, stress indicators, behavioral compliance. It's all part of the new safety assessment protocols." But as I watched, I noticed that the safety coordinators weren't just recording data. They were also administering something small, devices that looked like hearing aids, which they placed briefly in certain children's ears. The process took only a few seconds per child, and most of the kids didn't even seem to notice. "What are those devices?" I asked. Dr. Holloway's smile became sharper. "Sensory calibration tools. Some children have difficulty processing emergency instructions due to auditory processing differences. These devices help optimize their response patterns." After the drill, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The children who had Received the devices seemed quieter than usual, more compliant. When I asked my colleague Sarah about it, she looked at me strangely. What devices? She said. I didn't see any devices. That night, I went back to the school. I told myself I was just picking up some papers I'd forgotten, but really, I wanted to look around without Dr. Holloway's watchful eyes on me. I used my key card to get into the building and made my way down to the basement conference room. The door was locked, but I could hear voices inside. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Batch 17 showing 94% compliance rates. Neural pathway modification holding steady. Recommend expanding the program to Lincoln Elementary. I recognized Dr. Holloway's voice, but there were others too. People I didn't know, discussing children like they were lab specimens. I heard them mention specific nameskids from my class, from the other classes. They were talking about cognitive restructuring and behavioral modification and Phase 2 implementation. That's when I heard my own name. David Morrison is becoming problematic, Dr. Holloway said. He's asking too many questions, making too many observations. We may need to consider accelerated integration. What's his psychological profile? Another voice asked. Highly empathetic, strong moral compass, difficulty with authority when it conflicts with his values. Classic resistance indicators. Recommendation: either full conversion or elimination. I'll make the determination after tomorrow's drill. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. Whatever was happening at Clearwater Elementary, it was bigger than unusual fire drills. It was systematic, organized, and it had been going on for years. I spent the rest of the night researching Dr. Holloway online. What I found made my blood run cold. She'd been at 5 different schools over the past 20 years, always staying long enough to implement her innovative programs before moving on to the next district. And at every school, there were reports of unusual incidents. Children who changed dramatically after certain fire drills. Teachers who left the profession suddenly. Parents who moved away without explanation. The next morning, I called in sick. I knew I couldn't go back to that school, not knowing what I knew, but I also knew I couldn't just walk away. There were children involved, kids who trusted me to protect them. I contacted the police, but they were polite and dismissive. I called the district office, but Dr. Holloway's reputation preceded her. I even tried the FBI, but without concrete evidence, they couldn't act on what they called conspiracy theories. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the media. The investigative reporter I contacted was skeptical at first, but she agreed to look into it. We planned to meet the following week. After she'd had a chance to do some preliminary research, I never made it to that meeting. On Friday afternoon, I received a call from Dr. Holloway. David, she said in that smooth, authoritative voice, I understand you've been having some concerns about our programs. Why don't you come in and we can discuss them? I think you'll find our conversation ... enlightening. I knew I shouldn't go. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from Clearwater Elementary as possible. But I also knew that if I didn't confront this, if I didn't get proof of what was happening, those children would continue to be victimized. I arrived at the school just as the afternoon dismissal was ending. Dr. Holloway met me at the main entrance, her smile as warm and welcoming as ever. I'm so glad you came, she said. I think it's time you understood what we're really doing here. She led me down to the basement, past the conference room, to a section of the building I'd never seen before. The walls here were older, more institutional, lined with pipes and electrical conduits. We walked through a series of locked doors, each one requiring her key card, until we reached a room that took my breath away. It was a monitoring station, filled with screens showing live feeds from classrooms throughout the school. But these weren't security cameras. These were brain scans, neural activity patterns, real-time displays of children's thoughts and emotions. Beautiful, isn't it? Dr. Holloway said, her voice filled with genuine pride. 15 years of development, and we can now monitor and modify the neural patterns of every child in the building. On the screens, I could see the children I taught, their brain activity displayed in flowing patterns of color and light. Some of the patterns were natural, chaotic, human. Others were different, more regular, more controlled, like the neural equivalent of a computer program. The fire drills, I whispered. Just the delivery system, she confirmed. The real work happens continuously, through modified light fixtures that emit specific frequencies, through the water supply, through the very air they breathe. We've created the perfect environment for cognitive development. You're experimenting on children. We're evolving them, she corrected. Humanity is at a crossroads, David. We can continue to stumble along with our chaotic, inefficient minds, or we can take the next step. Create a generation that thinks more clearly, acts more rationally, serves the greater good without the burden of destructive emotions. She gestured to the screens. These children will become leaders, innovators, the foundation of a better world. And it all starts here, in schools like this one. I stared at the monitors, watching the brain patterns of kids I'd taught, kids I'd grown to love, being manipulated in real time. What about consent? What about their parents? Their parents selected this school because of its reputation for excellence, Dr. Holloway said. They've given us implicit permission to do whatever it takes to optimize their children's potential. And as for consent, she smiled that sharp smile again. Children can't consent to education, David. They simply receive it. I turned to leave, but the door had sealed shut behind us. Dr. Holloway's expression became sympathetic, almost maternal. I'm sorry, David. I really hoped you would understand. You have so much potential as an educator, but your resistance patterns are too strong, your emotional responses too unpredictable. You're what we call a contamination risk. She pressed a button on one of the consoles, and suddenly the room filled with a sound. I recognized the same pure, penetrating tone that Alina had described in her story. But this was stronger, more focused, designed specifically for my neural pattern. I could feel it trying to burrow into my mind, to rewrite my thoughts and emotions. But something Alina had said in her account gave me an idea. I focused on the memory of why I'd become a teacher in the first place, not for the system, not for the institution, but for the children themselves. I thought about Tommy, who struggled with reading but lit up when I found books about dinosaurs, about Maria, who was shy and quiet but had the most beautiful singing voice, about Jake, who was hyperactive and disruptive but just needed someone to channel his energy in positive ways. These weren't problems to be solved or behaviors to be modified. They were human beings, unique and precious exactly as they were. The sound grew louder, more insistent, but I held on to those memories. I thought about every child I'd ever taught, every moment of joy and discovery I'd witnessed, every reason I'd fallen in love with teaching. And slowly, impossibly, the sound began to fade. Dr. Holloway's face twisted with rage. No, she hissed. You will comply. You will integrate. You will serve the greater good. But the spell was broken. I could see her clearly now, not the respected educator I'd admired, but something else. Something that had been wearing her face for so long it had forgotten what it really was. The door behind me clicked open, not because she'd opened it, but because the building's fire suppression system had detected the unusual electromagnetic activity in the room. Real alarms were sounding, and real firefighters were entering the building. I ran through the corridors, past the classrooms where children sat in neat rows while their brains were being quietly rewired, past the teachers who had been converted into willing accomplices, past the monitoring stations and the modification equipment, and all the technological horrors that lurked beneath the surface of what looked like a normal elementary school. I made it outside just as the fire department arrived. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, but by the time they searched the building, the basement levels had been sealed off. Dr. Holloway was nowhere to be found, and the official story was that there had been a malfunction in the building's electrical system. I left teaching that day. I couldn't risk being placed in another school, couldn't trust that the next principal or district administrator wasn't part of the same network. I've spent the past 6 years working as a private tutor, helping kids who've been damaged by the system, trying to undo some of the harm that's been done. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound. The tone that tried to steal my soul, that's still being used in schools across the country to turn children into something other than human. And sometimes I wonder if I really escaped it, or if this is just what they want me to think, that I'm free, that I'm fighting back, when really I'm just another part of their program. The truly terrifying thing is that I may never know for sure, but I do know this: they're still out there, embedded in the very institutions we trust to protect our children. And every time a fire alarm sounds in a school somewhere, there's a chance it's not about fire at all. It's about something much worse. These 3 stories represent just a fraction of the accounts I've collected over the past year. Marcus's encounter with the substitute teacher and the selection process, Elena's experience with the sound chamber and the attempt to reprogram her mind, David's discovery of a systematic program operating within the school system itself. Each story reveals a different aspect of the same horrifying truth, that the institutions we trust most, the people we rely on to protect and educate our children, may not be what they seem. That behind the facade of routine safety procedures and educational excellence, something far more sinister is at work. The pattern is clear, the network is real, and it's still operating. I've received dozens of similar stories since I started this investigation. Teachers who've seen things they can't explain, parents whose children came home different after certain fire drills, students who remember fragments of experiences that officially never happened. If you're listening to this and you have a story of your own, if you've experienced something during a fire drill that doesn't quite add up, if you've noticed changes in children or teachers that seem too systematic to be coincidental, please reach out. Share your story in the comments below, or contact me directly through the Dr. Boncho channel, because the only way to fight this conspiracy is to bring it into the light, to make enough noise that it can no longer hide behind the facade of routine and normalcy. The children are depending on us, and time is running out. If this video has opened your eyes to the truth, please hit that like button and subscribe to Dr. Boncho. We're so close to reaching 10,000 subscribers, and your support helps ensure that these stories continue to be told. The truth is out there, but it's up to us to make sure it doesn't stay buried. Thank you for listening, and remember, the next time you hear a fire alarm, ask yourself, is this really about fire, or is it about something far more terrifying?